All right, today I'm going to be talking about the chain of influence that classical antiquity had on the Renaissance. More specifically, I'm going to go over ancient Greece, then ancient Rome, then the Renaissance, and I'll touch on the medieval times for a little bit. But I'm going to talk about the influence they had on each other, the influence they had on the time, the influence they have now. All right, so I'm going to start with classical antiquity. This is going to include ancient Greek sculpture and ancient Roman sculpture. So, ancient Greek sculpture or ancient Greece can be basically wound up from 800 to 300 BCE. And according to Ancient History Encyclopedia, when their specific title of Greek sculpture, they reference these dates and also that the Greek society focused with and made art with clay, ivory, and bronze. They had a focus on naturalism. They took inspiration from Egyptian and Eastern monumental art. They had a focus on proportion, poise, idealized perfection of the human body, and they were striving for a lifelike, life-size sculpture. So here I'm going to use the Zeus or Poseidon piece, which is dated back to 406 BCE. It's made of bronze. It was recovered from a shipwreck off Cape Artemision, Greece in 1928. You can see here, if you look at his feet, that his toes are touching the ground, but his heels aren't. He is clearly in a moving position. If you look at his arms, they are spread out from his body, which is pretty revolutionary for the time, especially since they were taking inspiration from Egyptian art, which everything was very diagonal. The limbs are always close to the body. Um, the point I want to make here is how real life and naturalistic this piece is. They never were quite sure whether it was Zeus or Poseidon because they don't have the object that would be in the hand. It was either supposed to be a trident or a lightning bolt, but they think it's Zeus because they assume it's a lightning bolt. Next, we have ancient Roman sculpture. This spanned from 509 to 330 BCE, according to the Ancient History Encyclopedia. But depending on who you ask, it can go a little bit longer. The Intro to Ancient Roman Art, Khan Academy, said it was a little bit longer if you include the Byzantine Empire. They had a blend of Greek, realism, and Eastern influence. They used stone, metal, glass, and terracotta, but they focused with bronze and marble. They had schools which Romans, learned how to sculpt, and they focused with Greek sculptures and they replicated it. They ended up taking their own twist on it as well because there's two markets for the art during this time. There was aristocrats and middle class. The aristocrats preferred more classical idealistic art, which was very similar to the Greeks, while the middle class preferred more naturalistic and emotional art. And that's the piece here that I wanted to focus on. It's dated from anywhere between 212 and 217 AD. It's Roman, it's marble, and it's now on view at the Met, 5th Avenue in Gallery 169. If you look at this sculpture, if you look at this man, essentially, you can see from his eyebrow that it is frowning, kind of pushed together. He looks kind of irritated. He's looking off into the distance. His mouth is very solemn and almost tight. Um, he's very naturalistic. He looks like a person of the time. I also wanted to point it out another piece. This is mid-1st century AD. It's Roman. It's also made of marble. And the point I wanted to make here is how fleshy and naturalistic this piece looks. We get a real sense of how people looked and felt at the time. So yes, they did take influence from the Greeks, but they did have their own twist on it. Their emphasis was on emotion. So now I want to touch on the Middle Ages really quickly and just why naturalism disappears. It disappeared because there was a focus on religion and Christianity during the Middle Ages. I got my information from the Face of Medieval Sculpture, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Really went into all detail about why there was imagery of biblical characters and stories on almost every single cathedral. It's because most people didn't speak Latin at the time, and their influence from the religion came from the art, and that's why art became more abstract and it became more about biblical characters and stories. Though during the Renaissance there is a shift in upper class about their want for more naturalistic, physical realism, classical composition. The Renaissance, first off, means rebirth. It comes from anywhere from 1400 to 1600 AD or 15th to 16th century, depending on who you asked. My resources come from medieval architecture, their piece on Renaissance sculpture, and the Italians' Renaissance art, and their article on Renaissance sculpture from Florence and Rome. So it was a cultural movement started in Italy. It was not only about the art, but it was also about literature. Um, there's many arguments about whether or not it really touched the people, but for right now, I'm going to just focus on this piece in specific. So this piece was by Guillaume Bologna. It's the abduction of a 17 woman, and it's dated from anywhere from 1581 to 83. It's marble, and it is 410 centimeters high. So this piece, what I'm looking at right now, is I want to point out that how realistic they look and how much emotion they have, and not only are they taking the influence in the actual architecture of the piece, but the story itself. This is a historical story from the Romans. Um, so not only are they combining the actual technique of physical realism and classical composition, but they are taking the actual stories from classical antiquity. The next piece I want to look at is also by Guillaume Bologna. It's Hercules and the Centaur Nessus from 1599. It's marble, and the photo was taken by Riccardo Andrea Frantis. The point I want to make here is how detailed this piece is. If you look at the centaur's hand pressing up against Hercules, you could see actually imprints in what should be the chest. You can see veins, and this is also coming from the fact that science has progressed and people understand the muscle composition more throughout these people. The big point I want to get here is that they took this story from Greek mythology and then they made it in a classical way, which dates all back to classical antiquity. The big point I want to get here is the influence these societies had on each other. You know, how did the ancient Greek and Roman societies influence the Renaissance? How influential was the art on the contemporaries versus the next time period? And how much did the Renaissance actually touch on the lives of the people of the time period? The argument I want to make here is yes, and classical antiquity did influence the Renaissance. The Romans looked back on the Greek, and the Europeans of the Renaissance, especially Italians, looked back to classical antiquity and what kind of art they wanted to make. But how influential was it actually during those time periods? Yes, Greek artists became a little bit reputable. They had their names listed on their art. The Romans, you don't see that as much, so you don't know how much celebrity-like status they really got from their art and how much it affected the people of the time. The Renaissance, we can clearly see that the art that was made was just for very people of high standings, and the artists themselves, they were the only ones who were influenced by it. Most peasants and common folk and even middle class were still, their lives were completely controlled by the church. They didn't really have an influence of literature and or art. But the point I want to make here is that yes, art is influential a little bit on the contemporaries, but it's the next time period that really appreciates it. We group together the Renaissance, the 15th and 16th century, but did the people of the time really know what was going on? No, they didn't. They didn't go out and saying, we're in the middle of the Renaissance. They didn't even know about the art that was going on. So art is important. It always is. But it's more important to the people that look back on it. You know, they're the ones who can group up all the little stories and make them into a big story. The people of the time are just focused on what's going on around. Right here, I have my works cited, and thank you for listening.